The wind off the northern plains in late October carried a particular kind of cruelty that no man, no matter how long he had lived beneath that endless Dakota sky, ever fully made peace with. It came without warning, sweeping down from the gray-bellied clouds in long, savage gusts that drove grit into the eyes and stole the breath clean from the lungs. It bent the dry buffalo grass flat against the earth and set the scrub cedar rattling like old bones in a burlap sack. It was a wind that did not merely chill a man. It reminded him, in no uncertain terms, how small and temporary he truly was. Sumpta Wolfstride had known that wind his entire life. He was 34 years old, lean and hard as sun-cured rawhide, with a broad, angular face that carried the quiet dignity of a man who had endured a great deal without ever asking anyone to take notice. His hair was black as a raven's wing, worn in 2 long braids wrapped in strips of tanned deer hide, and his dark eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that the world revealed far more of itself to those who watched without speaking. He rode with the natural, unhurried ease of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it, his back straight, his hands loose on the reins, his attention distributed evenly across the wide landscape the way water spreads across flat stone. He had been born in the shadow of the Black Hills, the youngest son of a respected Oglala Lakota elder who had taught him to read the land the way other men read scripture. To track a deer by the way frost settled unevenly on a hillside. To know weather by the behavior of meadowlarks. To understand that the earth was not a possession but a conversation, and that a man who stopped listening to it eventually got himself killed. Those lessons had kept Sumpta alive through years that had broken men far larger and louder than himself. He had fought in the resistance skirmishes of the early 1870s, ridden as a scout across 3 territories, and watched the world he had grown up in get carved apart and parceled off with a speed that still struck him as a kind of violence, even when it was done with ink and paper rather than rifles. After the death of his father 4 winters past, Sumpta had made a deliberate and considered choice. He had withdrawn from the larger conflicts of the age and settled into the life of a solitary wayfarer, moving between the scattered frontier settlements of the Dakota Territory as a trader and occasional hired tracker, carrying little more than what he needed and answering to no one. His base of operations, if a man as unattached as Sumpta could be said to have such a thing, was the rough and weather-beaten trading post settlement of Tumbleweed Crossing, situated at the junction of 2 old buffalo trails approximately 40 miles southwest of the Missouri River. Tumbleweed Crossing was not a town so much as a collection of stubborn intentions gathered in one place. It had a general store, a livery, a cramped land office that doubled as the local postmaster, a saloon that served whiskey of genuinely questionable origin, and perhaps 60 permanent residents who had collectively decided that this particular patch of wind-scoured Dakota earth was worth fighting the climate for. It was not a place that appeared on many maps. It was the kind of settlement that existed because the frontier demanded it, raw and functional and utterly indifferent to comfort. Sumpta kept a small, meticulously maintained camp on the eastern edge of the settlement, close enough to conduct his trading business but far enough from the noise of the saloon to sleep without interruption. He owned 2 mules, a pair that had been together so long they seemed to operate as a single organism split between 2 bodies. The first was Dust, a stocky, pale-coated jack with one permanently flattened ear from an old injury and a disposition that swung between serene cooperation and absolute, immovable refusal with very little in between. The second was Cinder, darker, leaner, and considerably more vocal, with a habit of expressing her opinions about any given situation through a range of brays, snorts, and long-suffering sighs that Sumpta had come to interpret with reasonable accuracy over the 3 years they had traveled together. They were not glamorous animals. They were not fast. But they were steady and sure-footed across terrain that would have lammed a horse, and they possessed a practical intelligence that Sumpta had come to respect in the quiet, unsentimental way he respected all things that proved their worth over time. He trusted them. In the sparse arithmetic of a solitary wayfarer's life on the Dakota frontier, that trust was not a small thing. The trouble began on a gray Tuesday morning in the last week of October, 1878. Sumpta had risen before first light, as was his habit, built a small fire, and eaten a careful breakfast of dried venison and black coffee before breaking camp with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it so many times the movements had become something close to ceremony. He had a trading run to complete, carrying a load of cured hides and a crate of iron cookware from Tumbleweed Crossing south to the small homestead cluster at Pale Creek Bend, a round trip of roughly 18 miles across open, gently rolling prairie. He had made the run a dozen times. He knew every bend in the trail, every draw and dry wash, every landmark between the 2 points. It was, by any reasonable measure, an unremarkable errand. He had loaded both mules carefully, distributing the weight with the precision of long experience, checked their hooves and harness straps, and set off south along the familiar packed earth trail as the sky above the plains shifted from black to a cold, pewter gray. Dust walked in front, as always, with Cinder following on a loose lead rope, and for the first mile everything proceeded exactly as it always did. The plains stretched out in every direction, silent and immense, broken only by the occasional stunted cedar tree and the distant dark line of a dry creek bed running roughly east to west about 2 miles south of the settlement. That creek bed was called Harrow Draw by the locals, a name that had originated, as far as Sunkta could determine, from nothing more specific than the vaguely ominous look of the place. It was a wide, shallow depression in the earth, its banks eroded into crumbling shelves of pale clay, its bed choked with dead cottonwood branches and old flood debris. In summer, a thin trickle of water ran through it. By late October, it was bone dry. The trail to Pale Creek Bend crossed Harrow Draw at a low, easy ford about half a mile east of a distinctive split-trunked cottonwood that served as the standard landmark for travelers navigating that stretch of prairie. The crossing was shallow, firm-bottomed, and presented no difficulty whatsoever for loaded mules. Except that morning, Dust stopped walking approximately 200 yards before the ford. Sunkta felt the resistance through the lead rope before he had fully registered that the mule had halted. He turned in the saddle, expecting to find that a pack strap had worked loose or that Cinder had planted her hooves over something in the trail. But both mules were standing still, their heads raised, their ears swiveled sharply to the west, aimed at the far end of Harrow Draw where the creek bed curved away toward a low line of scrub and the open prairie beyond. Dust's nostrils were flaring in long, deliberate pulls. Cinder had gone completely silent, which was unusual enough to be immediately notable. Sunkta scanned the western horizon with the unhurried, systematic attention of a trained tracker. He saw nothing. No movement in the scrub. No dust rising from the prairie. No birds lifting suddenly from cover. The wind was from the northwest, steady and cold, and it carried nothing to his nose but the familiar smell of dry grass and approaching snow. He clicked his tongue, tightened the lead rope, and urged Dust forward. Dust took 3 steps toward the ford and stopped again. This time, the mule turned his entire body to face west, away from the trail entirely, and began pulling toward the far end of Harrow Draw with a slow, insistent pressure that required genuine physical effort to resist. Cinder followed his lead without hesitation, both animals leaning into their halters with a coordinated, purposeful determination that was entirely unlike the random stubbornness Sunkta occasionally encountered from them on difficult terrain. He fought them for a while. He was a patient man, but he was also a practical one, and he had a delivery to complete in daylight that would not last forever this late in the season. He tried redirecting them toward the ford 3 separate times. Each time, both mules swung back to face west, ears fixed, bodies straining, pulling toward the far bend of Harrow Draw with a quiet, relentless urgency that made the skin along Sunkta's forearms prickle beneath his coat. It was not the behavior of animals who had caught a predator's scent. There was no panic in them, no wide-eyed terror, no instinct to flee. It was something more considered than fear. It was something that felt, uncomfortably, like intent. Sunkta stood in the cold October wind and studied his mules for a long moment. Then he turned and looked west along the dry creek bed, at the pale clay banks and the tangle of dead cottonwood limbs and the distant curve where the draw bent out of sight. He thought about his delivery. He thought about the mule's record, 3 years of reliable, sensible behavior on every trail he had asked them to walk. He thought about what his father had told him once, sitting beside a fire in the Black Hills when Sunkta was perhaps 12 years old. He had said that animals do not waste their attention on things that do not matter. A man who ignores what his animals are trying to tell him is a man who has decided that his own certainty is worth more than the truth. His father had been talking about horses at the time, and the lesson had been delivered in the context of a specific and now half-forgotten incident involving a river crossing that had turned dangerous. But the principle, Sunkta had long since concluded, was universal. He secured the load on both mules, checked that nothing would shift, and dropped the lead rope. Immediately, without hesitation, Dust began walking west along the dry bed of Harrow Draw. Cinder fell in beside him. Sunkta followed. The walk along the creek bed took the better part of half an hour. The terrain was rough, the clay banks crumbling underfoot, the debris-choked floor of the draw forcing constant small detours around fallen branches and eroded gullies. The pale October light lay flat and cold across the landscape, draining color from everything it touched. The wind had dropped slightly as they moved into the shelter of the draw's banks, and in the relative quiet Sunkta became aware of a sound he had not noticed before. So faint it was barely distinguishable from the low moan of wind over the prairie above. Something between a tone and a breath. Intermittent. Irregular. He stopped walking and listened. It came again. Thin and wavering, from somewhere around the curve ahead, where the draw bent sharply south around a collapsed section of bank that had slid into the creek bed in some long-ago spring flood, leaving a low mound of pale clay and dead root systems partially blocking the channel. Dust had accelerated to a brisk walk. Cinder was keeping pace, her dark eyes fixed on the bend with an intensity that made her look almost human in her concentration. Sunkta's hand moved to the long-barreled Colt revolver on his hip. He did not draw it. He simply confirmed it was there, then kept walking. They came around the bend in the creek bed, and Sunkta stopped dead. Wedged into the angle between the collapsed bank and a massive, half-buried cottonwood root system, mostly concealed beneath a coating of pale clay dust and a crude covering of broken branches that had been pulled over it with evident deliberate intention, was a wagon. Not a freight wagon, not a homesteader's buckboard. It was a covered spring wagon of the kind used for longer journeys, the sort a traveling merchant or a family of means might use to cross open country in reasonable comfort. The canvas cover was partially torn, one wheel was shattered, and the whole frame sat at a severe angle where the left rear axle had snapped clean through. The horse that had pulled it was gone. The harness had not simply been cut free. It had been removed with care and taken away, which meant someone had been here after this wagon came to grief. And they had worked to hide what they left behind. Sunkta approached slowly, his eyes moving across every detail with the systematic precision of a man trained to read scenes of violence before he understood fully what he was looking at. The tongue of the wagon was splintered in a way consistent with a hard, sudden impact, as though the wagon had been driven or pushed at speed into the bank. The wheel hadn't broken from rough terrain. The spokes had been struck, hard, by something heavy and blunt, 2 or 3 blows at least, from the look of the fractured wood. Someone had deliberately disabled this wagon. He moved to the back of the wagon and pulled aside the crude covering of branches. The canvas flap was partially open. Inside the wagon, in the deep shadow beneath the torn cover, amid a scatter of overturned supplies and what appeared to be the contents of a traveling trunk strewn across the wagon bed, he saw a shape that did not belong to the debris. A person. Lying very still. Face turned away. A woman, from what he could determine, dressed in the practical dark wool of frontier travel, her clothing torn at the shoulder and stained dark along the left side in a way that told Sunkta everything he needed to know about what had been done to her before this wagon ended up at the bottom of Harrow Draw. Dust stepped forward and pressed his broad nose gently against the side of the wagon, letting out a low, rumbling sound that was almost too quiet to hear. Cinder stood absolutely still. Sunkta moved to the back of the wagon, set his boot on the broken step, and pulled himself up to look inside. He reached out and touched the woman's shoulder, carefully, prepared to move back fast if she came awake swinging. She did not move. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her throat, beneath the line of her jaw, and held his breath. The pulse was there. Faint and unsteady as a candle flame in a drafty room, but present. She was breathing in shallow, barely perceptible increments, and the coldness of her skin told him she had been lying in this wagon through at least one full night, possibly longer, in late October Dakota air that had dropped well below freezing after sundown. He lifted her carefully, one arm beneath her shoulders, one beneath her knees, and drew her out of the wreckage with the deliberate gentleness of a man who understood that there were injuries that couldn't be seen and that carelessness could finish what violence had started. As he brought her into the flat gray light of the creek bed, he got his first clear look at her face. She was young, perhaps 25 or 26, with sharp, fine-boned features that even in unconsciousness and injury carried a certain composed quality, as though her face had been arranged by long habit into an expression of careful calm. Her hair, a deep auburn, had come loose from whatever it had been pinned into and lay spread across his arm in tangled, clay-dusted waves. There was a bruise along her left cheekbone, deep and swollen. A cut along her hairline had bled and dried. And along her left side, where her coat had been torn open, the dark stain he had seen from a distance resolved itself into what it had always been. A wound. Not a graze. Someone had put a bullet in her, and she had survived it through nothing but the stubbornness of a body that had not yet been told it was supposed to quit. Sumta looked at her for a moment in the cold, still air of the dry creek bed. Then he looked at his mules, standing patient and calm on either side of him, their breath rising in small white clouds. He had no idea who this woman was. He had no idea what had been done to her, or by whom, or why a covered wagon had been driven into the bottom of Harrow Draw and covered with branches to hide it from the trail above. He had no idea what it was going to cost him to be the man who found her. What he knew was this. His mules had brought him here. And the woman was still breathing. Everything else was a question that would have to wait. He carried her to Cinder, who stood motionless with a patience she rarely extended to anything, and began the careful work of securing the unconscious woman across the mule's back for the ride back to Tumbleweed Crossing. The cold wind picked up again overhead, moving through the dry grass of the prairie above with a sound like distant rushing water. Somewhere to the north, beyond the gray horizon, the sky had the particular flat, iron quality that meant snow before nightfall. Sumta tightened the last strap, checked the woman's breathing one more time, and picked up Dust's lead rope. He looked once more at the hidden, broken wagon in the bend of the draw, at the deliberate way the branches had been arranged over it, at the careful removal of the harness. Whoever had done this had not been in a hurry. They had been thorough. They had expected this to stay hidden. They had not expected 2 mules and a Lakota wayfarer. Sumta clicked his tongue softly and turned north toward Tumbleweed Crossing. The mules followed without hesitation, steady and sure across the broken ground of Harrow Draw, carrying their burden with the quiet, unhurried dignity of animals that had known all along exactly where they needed to go. The snow came before they reached Tumbleweed Crossing. It arrived the way Dakota snow always did in late October, not with ceremony or gradual build-up, but as a sudden, decisive fact, as though the sky had simply made up its mind between one moment and the next. The flakes were small and hard, driven nearly horizontal by the northwest wind, stinging against the exposed skin of Sumta's face and hands as he walked north along the trail with Cinder's lead rope in his fist and the unconscious woman draped carefully across the mule's back. He had packed his heaviest blanket around her, tucking it tight against the cold, and she had not stirred once during the walk back. That stillness worried him more than any amount of thrashing would have. Dust walked ahead without being asked, his pale coat already beginning to collect a thin crust of snow along his broad back, his head lowered against the wind, his hooves finding the frozen trail with the patient certainty of long familiarity. Cinder stayed close behind Sumta, matching his pace exactly, as though she understood that the bundle secured across her back required a steadiness beyond her ordinary standards. The 3 of them moved through the thickening snowfall in a tight, purposeful line, and the prairie around them dissolved into a gray-white blur that swallowed distance and direction and left only the immediate world of cold and wind and the pressing necessity of forward motion. Tumbleweed Crossing materialized out of the snow as a cluster of dark, angular shapes against the white, the square bulk of the general store and the low, wide silhouette of the livery emerging first, then the scattered outlines of the smaller structures that comprised the settlement's modest geography. A few windows were already lit against the deepening gray of the afternoon, yellow squares of lamplight that looked, in the swirling snow, like something a man might navigate toward instinctively, the way moths move toward flame without reasoning about it. Sumta did not take the woman to the general store, where half a dozen residents would be gathered around the stove trading observations about the weather and each other's business. He did not take her to the saloon, for reasons that required no elaboration. He took her instead to the cabin of Hester Crane, the settlement's closest approximation of a physician, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had come west from Ohio 12 years ago with a doctor husband who had lasted 2 winters before a fever took him, and who had subsequently decided that someone in Tumbleweed Crossing needed to know what she knew, and that someone was going to be her. Hester had no formal medical credentials of her own. What she had was 20 years of watching her husband work and a mind that retained everything it encountered with the tenacious precision of a steel trap. Sancta had used her services twice, once for a knife wound sustained during a disagreement at the Pale Creek Bend trading post, and once for a broken finger that had set badly and needed re-breaking. Both times she had worked with a brisk, unsentimental competence that he had found deeply reassuring. He trusted her for the same reason he trusted his mules. She had demonstrated, repeatedly and without fanfare, that she knew what she was doing. He knocked on her door with 3 sharp raps, and she opened it almost immediately, as though she had heard him coming. She took one look at the blanket-wrapped form across Cinder's back, stepped aside without a word, and pointed at the wide table near the stove that served as her examination surface. They got the woman inside and onto the table, and Hester began her assessment with the focused, efficient economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She cut away the torn left side of the woman's coat and the layers beneath it with a pair of heavy shears, working carefully around the wound, and Sancta stood back near the door and let her work. The fire in Hester's stove was built high and the cabin was warm, almost uncomfortably so after the long cold walk from Harrowdraw, and the smell of wood smoke and pine resin and medicinal camphor filled the low-ceilinged space. The bullet wound was in the left side, below the ribs, a clean entry with no exit, which meant the bullet was still inside her. Hester confirmed this with a brief, careful probing that she performed with an expression of focused neutrality and reported to Sancta in the flat, factual tone of someone delivering information rather than rendering judgment. The woman had also sustained 2 broken ribs, likely from the impact when the wagon was disabled and she was thrown against the interior. There was the bruising and the cut along her hairline, consistent with a blow to the head. There was the exposure, a full night and possibly part of a second day in near-freezing conditions, which had done its own quiet damage to her core temperature and her body's capacity to fight what was already a serious wound. "She is not out of it yet," Hester said, not looking up from her work. "But she is not past it either. Bullet needs to come out tonight, before infection gets any further along than it already has. I will need you to stay." Sancta stayed. The extraction took the better part of 2 hours. Hester worked by the concentrated light of 3 oil lamps arranged around the table, her instruments laid out on a clean cloth with the orderly precision of long habit, and Sancta held the woman still when Hester needed her still and held the lamp when Hester needed more light and did not look away from any of it, because looking away from difficult things had never been his habit and he saw no reason to start now. The woman drifted in and out of a shallow, restless unconsciousness throughout the procedure, her face drawn tight with pain even in her insensible state, her uninjured hand closing and opening against the table surface in slow, involuntary rhythms. Once, near the end of the extraction, she spoke. Not words, exactly, more the shape of words, fragments of urgent speech compressed into something just below the threshold of intelligibility. Sancta caught 2 things clearly. A name, spoken with a sharpness that cut through the fog of her condition like something reflexive and deep-rooted. Gorham. And then, a moment later, with a different quality entirely, something that sounded less like a name and more like a warning, the land office. Then she subsided again, her breathing steadying into the slow, shallow rhythm of genuine unconsciousness, and Hester extracted the bullet with a soft sound of professional satisfaction and dropped it into a tin cup on the table where it rang like a small, ugly bell. Sancta looked at it. A standard .44 caliber round, the kind that fit half the revolvers and rifles on the frontier. It told him nothing specific and confirmed everything general. Someone had shot this woman at close enough range to put that bullet where it ended up, and they had done it deliberately, and they had then arranged for her and her wagon to disappear into the bottom of Harrow Draw where the snow and the cold and the scavengers would have completed the work within another day or two at most. He thought about the name she had said. Gorham. He had heard that name before. It took him until Hester had finished closing the wound and was washing her hands at the basin before the specific context surfaced in his memory, rising up through the accumulated sediment of 3 years of frontier trading and traveling and listening to the conversations of people who did not always notice him listening. Lexton Gorham. He had heard the name spoken at the Tumbleweed Crossing Land Office, perhaps 6 weeks ago, by a man whose name Sunkta had not caught, speaking in the lowered, careful voice people used when they were discussing something they did not want overheard. Gorham's men had been through the territory. Gorham was acquiring land claims along the creek bottoms south and east of the settlement. Gorham was not a man who accepted refusal with grace. He had not thought much of it at the time. Land acquisition and the rough practices that accompanied it were a constant feature of frontier life, as predictable and unremarkable as the seasonal floods that reshaped the creek bottoms every spring. He had filed it away and moved on. Now he retrieved it and examined it again in the new light of a bullet in a tin cup and a woman hidden in a dry creek bed. The woman's name, it turned out, was Avelini Hale. They learned this the following morning, when the fever that Hester had predicted arrived on schedule in the small hours and broke, violently and then completely, just before dawn, leaving the woman pale and wrung out but coherent, lying in Hester's narrow spare bed with her left side bound in clean linen and her dark auburn hair spread loose across the pillow. Sunkta was sitting in the chair beside the bedroom door, his long legs stretched out before him, his hat on his knee, when she opened her eyes. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of her surroundings with a careful, measuring attention that told him, even before she spoke, that this was a woman who did not surrender easily to confusion or panic. Her eyes moved across the low ceiling, the rough-hewn walls, the single window with its frost-edged glass, then to Hester's lamp burning low on the bedside table, and finally to Sunkta himself, sitting quiet and watchful in the chair. She studied him for a moment. He let her. "Where am I?" she said. Her voice was roughened by fever and disuse, but the steadiness in it was real. "Tumbleweed Crossing," Sunkta said. "A cabin belonging to a woman named Hester Crane, who pulled a bullet out of your side last night. You have been unconscious for the better part of 2 days." She absorbed this. Her eyes dropped briefly to her bandaged side, then returned to his face. "You found me," she said. "In the draw." "My mules found you," Sunkta said. "I just followed." Something moved across her expression at that, too complicated and too quick to read entirely, but with grief somewhere in it, and relief, and the particular quality of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a long time and has just been told, unexpectedly, that they do not have to carry it alone for the next few minutes. Her name was Avelini Hale. She was 27 years old, the daughter of a land surveyor named Edmund Hale who had spent 20 years mapping the creek bottoms and tableland of the Dakota Territory for the federal government before retiring to a small claim of his own at the edge of the Pale Creek Bend settlement. Edmund Hale had been, by every account Avelini offered, a meticulous and principled man, the kind of surveyor who understood that the accuracy of his maps was not merely a professional standard but a moral one, because men built their lives on the ground those maps described, and errors had consequences that outlasted the paper they were recorded on. 18 months ago, Edmund Hale had discovered something in the course of reviewing old survey records at the Territorial Land Office in Yankton. A discrepancy. Not a small one, not the kind of minor measurement variance that accumulated in field surveys conducted under difficult conditions. A large, deliberate, systematic discrepancy, a pattern of falsified boundary records that had quietly repositioned the legal descriptions of nearly 40 individual land claims along a 12-mile stretch of creek bottom south and east of Tumbleweed Crossing. The falsifications were sophisticated enough that they would not have been apparent to anyone without Edmund Hale's specific expertise and his specific access to both the original field notes and the recorded documents. But to a man who had spent 2 decades reading survey records, the alterations were as visible as boot tracks in fresh mud. The falsified records had the effect of transferring legal ownership of those 40 claims from the homesteaders and small ranchers who had settled and worked them to a series of shell companies whose ultimate ownership traced back, through a careful sequence of intermediary transactions, to a single man. Lexton Gorham. Sumpta listened to all of this without interrupting. He sat in the chair by the door with his hat on his knee and his face composed in the particular expression of quiet, focused attention that had served him well in every situation that required him to understand something complex and dangerous before he responded to it. Outside, the snow had stopped sometime in the night, and the pale morning light coming through the frost-edged window was the clean, flat white of a freshly covered prairie, the kind of light that made everything look simple and still and gave no indication whatsoever of the things moving beneath its surface. Avellini's father had taken his discovery to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Yankton. The commissioner had listened carefully, thanked him courteously, and done nothing. Edmund Hale had then written directly to the Federal Land Office in Washington. 3 months later he had received a form letter acknowledging receipt of his correspondence. 2 months after that, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Edmund Hale had been found at the bottom of a ravine 4 miles from his claim, his horse standing riderless at the top of the bank. The official finding was accidental death. Avellini Hale had known from the morning they told her that it was not an accident. She had known it with the absolute, unargued certainty of a daughter who understood her father, and she had spent the 14 months since his death doing quietly and carefully what he had done loudly and through official channels, because she had watched what the official channels produced. She had gone back to the original survey records herself. She had located 3 of the displaced homesteaders who still had their original land grant documents, the physical paper copies that predated the falsified records in the Territorial Office, and she had obtained sworn statements from each of them, witnessed and signed and legally sufficient to constitute evidence. She had compiled everything her father had found and everything she had found herself into a document case that she had been carrying in a locked compartment beneath the floorboards of her spring wagon when Lexton Gorham's men had run her off the trail south of Tumbleweed Crossing and put a bullet in her left side. The document case, Sumpta said. Gone, Avellini said. Her voice was flat and even on the word, the voice of someone who had already finished grieving that particular loss and moved on to the next problem. They took it before they hid the wagon. I watched them through a gap in the canvas. 3 men. They went through everything. They found the compartment. She paused. I had a duplicate, she said then, and something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly. More the look of a chess player who has just revealed that the piece her opponent captured was not the one that mattered. She had made copies. 2 sets. The second set was not in the wagon. Where is it? Sumpta asked. She looked at him for a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they are deciding whether to trust, weighing everything available, his face, his stillness, the fact that he had brought her here instead of leaving her in the draw, the fact that his mules had found her when nothing else had. Hidden, she said finally. In a place Gorham's men will not think to look, because they believe they have already found everything. But I cannot get to it alone. Not in this condition. And if I stay in one place long enough for Gorham to hear that I survived, he will send men here, and it will not matter where the copies are hidden because neither of us will be in any condition to deliver them anywhere. Sumpta was quiet for a moment. The fire in Hester's stove ticked and settled. Outside, dust let out a long, resonant bray from somewhere near the livery, a sound that carried clearly through the cold morning air, and Cinder answered him from closer by, from the direction of Sumpta's camp at the edge of the settlement. He thought about what it would mean to step into this. He was a wayfarer, a trader, a man who had deliberately constructed his life around a minimum of entanglement with the conflicts of other people. He had survived the preceding decade by being useful without being essential, present without being involved, a man who moved through the world without leaving enough of himself in any one place for the world to get a firm grip on. He thought about his mules in the dry creek bed, the patient, insistent way they had pulled against their halters for 2 days, refusing to let him pass by what needed to be found. He thought about Avellini Hale's father at the bottom of a ravine, his horse standing riderless at the top of the bank, and a territorial commissioner in Yankton who had listened carefully and done nothing. He put his hat on. "Where are the copies hidden?" he said. Avellini looked at him steadily. Her hazel eyes were clear and direct, carrying neither appeal nor performance, simply the level gaze of a woman who asked for exactly what she needed and nothing more. "There is a loose stone in the base of the chimney at my father's old claim cabin at Pale Creek Bend," she said. "Behind the stone there is a tin box. Everything is in the tin box." She paused. "Gorham's men burned the claim 2 months ago. They believe there is nothing left there worth searching. They are wrong." Sunkta stood up from the chair, his lean frame unfolding to its full height in the low-ceilinged room. He looked at the woman in the bed, the careful steadiness of her despite the bandaged side and the pallor of blood loss and 2 days of fever. He thought that she was one of the most thoroughly composed people he had encountered in a long time, and that the composure was not the brittle kind that shattered under pressure but the deep, structural kind that came from having already survived the worst thing and found oneself still standing afterward. "I will be back before dark," he said. He walked out of Hester's cabin into the cold white morning and across the frozen ground to where Dust was tied at the livery rail, stamping his hooves against the cold and eyeing Sunkta with the alert, forward-tilted attention of an animal that had been waiting for the next thing and was prepared to get on with it. Sunkta checked the cinch, swung up into the saddle, and turned south toward Pale Creek Bend. The prairie lay open and white and silent in every direction, and the sky above it was the pale, washed-out blue of a Dakota morning after first snow, enormous and still and giving nothing away. 18 miles there and 18 miles back, across open country, in winter, to a burned claim cabin that Lexton Gorham's men believed held nothing worth finding. He did not know yet what was waiting for him at Pale Creek Bend. He did not know who else might be watching the trail south of Tumbleweed Crossing, or what Gorham had been told about the woman in the draw, or how much time remained before the wrong people learned that Avellini Hale had survived. There were a great many things he did not know, and he was a man who had learned to be comfortable with not knowing, to move through uncertainty the way his mules moved through difficult terrain, one careful step at a time, weight balanced, eyes forward, trusting the ground to be there when the hoof came down. What he knew was enough to move on. The rest would become clear when it became clear. He touched his heels to Dust's sides and rode south into the white. The burned cabin at Pale Creek Bend was a worse sight than Sunkta had anticipated. He had expected destruction. What he found was something more deliberate than destruction, something that crossed the line between burning a structure and making a statement. The cabin's 4 walls had collapsed inward, leaving a low rectangle of charred timber and ash that the recent snow had dusted white on the upper surfaces, so that it looked, from a distance, like a wound that had been partially bandaged and then abandoned. The stone chimney still stood at the north end, rising intact from the rubble to its full height, which was the only piece of information Sunkta needed to confirm that the ride had been worthwhile. But the rest of it, the careful completeness of the destruction, the way the outbuildings had been brought down separately rather than caught by the main blaze, told him that whoever had done this had not been satisfied with simply removing the structure. They had wanted the land to look as though nothing had ever been built on it at all. They had wanted to erase the fact of habitation itself, to make the ground say that no one had ever stood here, planted here, built a life here, so that whatever came next would have no history to contend with. He tied Dust to a cedar post that had survived the fire at the edge of what had been the yard and walked slowly around the perimeter of the ruin before approaching the chimney. Old habit, and a good one. A man who walked directly toward the thing he had come for without first reading the ground around it was a man who occasionally walked into situations he could have anticipated and avoided. He read the ground carefully. The snow had covered most of the older sign, but the chimney base showed 2 sets of boot tracks in the fresh fall, both approaching from the south and both departing in the same direction. The tracks were at least a day old, the edges softened by subsequent freezing and the thin overnight snowfall. Gorham's men had been here after the storm began, confirming the cabin was empty, and had left satisfied. What the tracks also told him was that the 2 men had not come close to the chimney. They had stood at the edge of the ruin, looked at the standing stonework from a distance of perhaps 20 feet, and turned around. Men who had already burned a place and taken what they came for did not spend long examining the wreckage of their own work. They had no reason to crouch in the ash and run their hands along the base stones of a chimney they had left standing, because pulling down 20 feet of fieldstone mortared construction was more effort than the thoroughness of their search required. It was the particular blindness of men who believed a job was finished, the kind of blindness that made them sloppy in ways that careful people could use. Sunkta crouched at the chimney base and ran his hands along the lower stones. The loose one was the fourth from the left on the second course, a flat-faced piece of gray Dakota fieldstone approximately the size and shape of a large book, seated slightly proud of its neighbors and with a fine line of disturbed mortar along its upper edge that was visible only when you were looking for it from a distance of about 8 inches. He worked it free with his hunting knife, patient and careful, the cold making his fingers less cooperative than he would have liked, and set it aside on the snow-dusted ash. Behind it, in a cavity roughly the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of waxed cord, was a flat tin box. He did not open it there. He tucked it inside his coat against his body, replaced the stone as closely as he could approximate its original position, and walked back to Dust without looking around. Looking around was what men did when they were nervous, and nervousness was visible at considerable distance to anyone who happened to be watching the trail or the ruin from the tree line to the south. He mounted, turned north, and rode back toward Tumbleweed Crossing at the same easy pace he had come, a trader on a routine winter errand carrying nothing of particular interest to anyone. He believed this performance for approximately 4 miles. Then Dust's ears went flat against his skull and the mule broke stride, a subtle disruption in the steady rhythm of his hooves that Sunkta felt through the saddle before he consciously registered what it meant. He did not look behind him. He let his eyes move naturally across the landscape ahead, the way they always moved, slow and methodical and unsurprised, while his other senses reached backward. The wind was from the northwest, which meant anything behind him was upwind. He could not smell horses. He could not hear hoofbeats over the low persistent moan of the wind across the open grass. The prairie stretched away in every direction, white and silent and offering nothing. But Dust had told him something was there, and Dust had a longer record of being right about these things than Sunkta did. He rode another quarter mile at the same unhurried pace, then turned Dust east along a shallow drainage that angled away from the main trail, as though he had decided to check the condition of a creek crossing before committing to it. Once below the line of the prairie surface, in the marginal concealment of the drainage's low banks, he stopped and turned in the saddle and looked south along the trail he had just ridden. 2 riders. Perhaps half a mile back, moving at a walk, keeping pace with him without closing the distance. They were too far away for him to read faces or details, but the way they rode, upright and deliberate, with none of the relaxed, variable posture of men on a routine journey, told him everything he needed to know. They were men who were following someone and knew they were following someone and had decided that keeping the distance constant was sufficient concealment. They were not wrong, exactly. For most men, that distance would have been enough. But most men did not have a mule named Dust. Sunkta turned north and rode for Tumbleweed Crossing at a pace that was not quite a gallop but was considerably more purposeful than his earlier progress. He reached the settlement as the afternoon light was beginning its early winter retreat, the shadows of the buildings stretching long and blue across the frozen ground. He went directly to Hester's cabin, tied Dust at the rail, and went inside without knocking. Adalini was sitting up in the bed, the wool blanket pulled to her waist, working through a bowl of Hester's prairie chicken soup with the focused concentration of someone who understood that eating was currently a medical obligation as much as anything else. She looked better than she had that morning. Color had returned to her face, and the sharpness in her eyes was cleaner and less effortful, the look of a mind that had recovered enough ground to start making plans again rather than simply enduring. She looked at Sunkta when he came in, read something in the set of his shoulders, and put the bowl down without finishing it. He set the tin box on the bed beside her without preamble. She looked at it for a moment. Her hand came out from under the blanket and rested on the lid, not opening it, just resting there, and Sunkta saw something move through her face that was private and complicated and that he did not try to name or interpret. It was hers. Then she looked up at him. "I was followed back from Pale Creek Bend," Sunkta said. 2 riders. They did not come into the settlement. They stopped at the tree lean south of the trail and watched me ride in. He met her eyes steadily. They know you survived. Or they know someone retrieved something from the burn site. Either way, Gorham will know by tomorrow morning. Hester, who had been at her work table with her back to the room and who had the particular quality of appearing not to listen while absorbing everything, turned around and folded her arms across her chest. "How long do we have?" she said, directing the question at no one in particular because it was the question that mattered regardless of who answered it. "Not long enough to move her safely to Yankton," Sunkta said. "Not in her condition, not in this weather, not with men watching the southern trail." "She cannot stay here," Hester said. "If Gorham sends enough men into this settlement and asks enough questions, someone will tell him where she is. Not out of malice. Out of the ordinary human inability to keep their mouths shut when a large and frightening man is asking direct questions in a small place where everyone knows everyone else's business and no one has any particular investment in keeping a stranger's secrets." "I know," Sunkta said. He stood in the middle of Hester's warm, lamplit cabin and thought with the focused, problem-oriented precision of a man whose life had required him to be good at it. He thought about the terrain and the weather and the trails. He thought about Avellini's condition and what she could realistically manage. He thought about what resources existed between Tumbleweed Crossing and the nearest federal authority that could not be reached by Gorham's influence. And then he thought about something that had been sitting at the edge of his attention since the previous night, a detail from Avellini's account that he had filed and not yet retrieved. He looked at her. "There is a man at the Tumbleweed Crossing Land Office," he said. "Named Aldred Pruitt. He has been here 12 years. He processes claim filings and deed transfers. He was here before Gorham's men started working this territory." He looked at her carefully. "You mentioned the land office twice last night, once in your fever and once when you were clear. I do not think you mentioned it by accident." Avellini was quiet for a moment. The lamplight moved across her face as a draft stirred the flame. Then she said, "My father went to Pruitt before he went to Yankton. Pruitt told him he had not noticed any irregularities and advised him to take his concerns to the territorial commissioner." She paused. "But my father noted in his records that Pruitt was sweating when he said it, and that the window behind his desk was open despite it being February." "A man sweating in February with his window open," Sunkta said. "Is a man who is afraid of something in the room with him," Avellini said. "Pruitt processed those deed transfers," Sunkta said. "He has the originals in his office files. And careful men who understand that their only protection is the paper trail they leave behind, keep copies of everything they process, particularly when what they are processing makes them sweat in February." Another silence. The stove ticked. Outside, wind moved along the eaves. "You want to go to Pruitt tonight," Avellini said. "Before Gorham's men come," Sunkta said. She looked at him with the direct, measuring attention he was beginning to recognize as her natural mode of engagement. "Pruitt will not help you easily," she said. "He will have spent 18 months convincing himself that staying quiet was the only reasonable option, and men who have spent a long time justifying a position to themselves do not abandon it gracefully when a stranger appears at their door. Then we need to show him that the position he has been occupying is no longer the safe one," Sunkta said. He left Hester's cabin as the last of the afternoon light faded and the settlement settled into the quiet of a frontier winter evening, fires built high in every building, the few residents who had reason to be outside moving quickly between structures with their collars up and their heads down. The land office occupied a narrow single-story building wedged between the general store and a disused freight depot, its front window dark but a thin line of lamplight visible beneath the door indicating that Aldred Pruitt, as was apparently his habit, was working late. Sunkta knocked. A long pause in which he could hear the specific silence of a man deciding whether to answer. Then the sound of a chair being pushed back, careful footsteps, and the door opened 2 cautious inches on a short, wiry man of perhaps 55 with a clerk's stoop and a clerk's indoor pallor and eyes that assessed the figure on his doorstep with the rapid, cornered calculation of someone who spent a significant portion of his life hoping that whatever knocked had come for someone else. "Aldred Pruitt," Sunkta said. I need to speak with you about the Hale survey documents and the Gorham deed transfers. The 2 inches of open door moved toward one. I don't know what you're talking about, Pruitt said, his voice carefully arranged into a tone of mild, bureaucratic puzzlement that did not quite cover the thing underneath it. The office is closed. Sumter placed his boot against the door frame. He did not push. He simply positioned it there so that closing the door would require a deliberate act of force rather than a natural continuation of the motion already begun, and looked at Pruitt with the patient, entirely unhurried expression of a man who had made his decision and was prepared to wait as long as the other man needed to make his. Edmund Hale is dead, Sumter said. His daughter has a bullet wound and 2 broken ribs and is lying in Hester Crane's cabin with documents that cannot reach a federal court without the originals from your files. There are men in the tree line south of this settlement tonight, and there will be more men by morning, and when those men come into this settlement asking questions, one of the questions they will be asking is who in Tumbleweed Crossing knew what was in those deed transfers and chose to say nothing. He held Pruitt's eyes. That question will eventually reach you. The only variable is whether it reaches you as a man who helped, or as a man who waited too long. The long silence of a man at the end of a calculation stretched across the cold air between them. Pruitt's jaw worked. His eyes moved past Sumter to the dark main track of the settlement, reading the emptiness of it, the absence of any immediate threat alongside the presence of a future and inevitable one. Then he opened the door. Sumter spent the better part of an hour in the land office. Pruitt, once the decision was made, proved to be precisely what a careful bureaucrat in a dangerous situation could be at his best, meticulous, thorough, and in possession of documentation that was worth considerably more than its physical weight. He had kept copies of every deed transfer connected to the 40 falsified claims, filed in a separate ledger that lived behind a loose panel in the bottom drawer of his desk, in a location he had apparently selected with the specific intention that it would be found if someone searched carefully but not if someone searched quickly. He had known the transfers were irregular within the first 3 he processed. He had filed them and kept his copies and said nothing for 18 months, not out of complicity but out of the particular cowardice of a man who had accurately assessed the personal cost of speaking and found it higher than he was willing to pay alone. He was willing to pay it now, with company. Back at Hester's cabin, Sumter and Avellini spread everything across the table and worked through it together by lamplight. Avellini moved through the documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this exact task for over a year, her father's survey notations in one hand, Pruitt's transfer originals in the other, the falsified boundary records laid out between them where the alterations in ink shade and numeral formation were visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Hester periodically refreshed their coffee and offered observations of such precise practical intelligence that Sumter quietly revised his estimate of her capacities to something considerably higher than he had initially assigned them. There is a federal marshal at Morrow Station, Avellini said, near the end of it. 40 miles northeast. His name is Callum Drew. He holds his authority directly from the Federal Circuit Court and has no connection to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office or anyone in it. If these documents reach Drew, he has both the jurisdiction and, from what I know of him, the inclination to act. Gorham's reach extends to the territorial offices and the local commissioners. It does not extend to the federal circuit. 40 miles northeast, Sumter said. In November. On compromised trails. With men watching the South Road and more coming. She looked at him with the level, uncomplicated directness that he had come to understand was simply how she engaged with difficult realities. Yes, she said. Exactly that. Sumter looked at the documents on the table, the careful, accumulated weight of 14 months of a dead man's work and his daughter's grief and 3 years of frightened silence from a land office clerk. He looked at the evidence of 40 families stripped of what they had built. He thought about the 2 men in the tree line south of the settlement, and the morning that was coming, and what it would bring with it. He began organizing the documents into their travel order, the sequence in which they would need to be presented to make the clearest possible case to a federal marshal seeing them cold for the first time. It was careful, methodical work, and it took time, and outside the window the night pressed cold and absolute against the frost-edged glass. Somewhere south of the settlement, in the darkness of the tree lane, two men sat their horses and watched the lights of Tumbleweed Crossing and waited for morning. He worked until the lamp oil ran low and the fire in the stove had settled to deep red coals, and when he finally set the last document in its place and looked up, Avellini was watching him from the bed with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. It was something more complicated than that, the look of a person who had been entirely alone in a dangerous place for a very long time and had just, for the first time in that long time, looked up and found that the place was no longer empty. Sumpta did not remark on the expression. He stood up, rolled the documents carefully in their oilcloth, and tied the bundle with the waxed cord from the tin box. He checked the loads in his coat by the dying lamplight, methodical and quiet. Then he set both items by the door where they would be ready to take up quickly, sat down in the chair beside the door, and pulled his hat over his eyes. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing. The settlement was completely still. And in that stillness, somewhere in the frozen dark south of Tumbleweed Crossing, the men in the tree lane sat and watched and waited, and did not yet know that the people they were waiting on had already moved past waiting into something else entirely. Sumpta was awake before the settlement was. He had not truly slept, only rested in that shallow, alert way that certain kinds of experience trained into a man, the kind of rest where the body recovered what it needed while the mind kept a low, continuous watch on the sounds of the world outside. He had heard the wind die completely sometime around midnight, leaving a silence so total it had its own texture, heavy and cold and pressing against the walls of the cabin. He had heard the fire in Hester's stove breathe itself down to near nothing in the small hours. He had heard Avellini shift once in her sleep, a brief sound quickly stilled. And at some point well before first light, he had heard what he had been waiting to hear without quite admitting to himself that he was waiting for it. Hoofbeats. More than 2 horses. Coming from the south. He was at the window before the sound fully resolved itself, easing the shutter open half an inch and looking out into the pre-dawn dark of the settlement's main track. The sky had cleared overnight and the stars were brilliant and merciless above the white prairie, throwing just enough light to distinguish shapes from shadows. 4 riders came in from the south trail at a walk, spreading out as they entered the settlement with the practiced, unhurried discipline of men who had done this kind of work before. They did not ride together. They separated, each taking a different angle through the settlement, covering the exits and the main structures with the methodical efficiency of a search pattern. Sumpta let the shutter ease back to its closed position and turned to the room. Hester was already awake, sitting in her chair by the dead stove with a wool shawl around her shoulders and her eyes open, which suggested she had not slept much either. Avellini was awake in the bed, propped on her good elbow, watching Sumpta's face for information. Both of them had the particular quality of people who understood that the time for questions had passed and the time for moving had arrived. For men, Sumpta said quietly. Working a search pattern. They are looking to confirm your location before they close in. He looked at Avellini. Can you ride? It was not quite a question. Avellini swung her legs over the side of the bed, set her boots on the floor, and stood up in a single careful motion that cost her something visibly but produced no sound. She reached for her coat. Yes, she said. They had perhaps 10 minutes, maybe less. Sumpta had thought through this possibility during the night and had arrived at a route that depended on 2 things, the fact that 4 men covering a settlement of 60 residents could not watch every direction simultaneously, and the fact that the northeast trail out of Tumbleweed Crossing ran behind the livery and the freight depot rather than along the main track, which meant a person departing that way would not be visible from the southern approach until they were already clear of the buildings. He gathered the oilcloth document bundle and the tin box, checked the Colt one more time, and looked at Hester. She was already at her back window, checking the alley behind the cabin. She turned and held up one finger. One man visible, moving west along the back of the general store, moving away from them. 30 seconds, Hester said. Then he turns the corner. Sumpta was at the back door with the documents in his coat and Avellini at his shoulder by the time Hester's count reached its end. They went out into the dark and cold in complete silence, crossing the frozen ground behind the cabin in quick, careful strides, Avellini keeping pace with a controlled determination that told him her pain was real and she had decided it was not relevant. They reached the back of the livery without being seen, slipped inside through the side door, and Sunkta began saddling Dust in the dark by feel, his hands moving through the familiar sequence without needing light to guide them. He saddled Cinder as well. A second horse would be conspicuous on the open prairie in full daylight, but they were not going to be on the open prairie in full daylight for long enough for that to matter if they moved now, while the dark still held. He helped Avellini onto Cinder, checking the stirrups and the position of her injured side without comment, and mounted Dust. He led them out the livery's northeast gate, across the short stretch of frozen ground behind the freight depot, and onto the northeast trail just as the eastern horizon began its first, barely perceptible shift from black toward the color of cold iron. The trail to Morrow Station ran northeast across 40 miles of open Dakota prairie, following the high ground between two drainage systems in a long, gradual arc that kept it clear of the worst of the creek bottom mud in wet weather and the worst of the snow drifts in winter. In good conditions, a rider covering it at a steady pace could make the journey in 7 hours. Their conditions were not good. The trail was frozen hard enough to be stable but rough with the heaved, uneven texture of ground that had thawed and refrozen multiple times in the preceding weeks, and Avellini's injuries meant they could not push the pace beyond what a trot would allow without real risk of doing damage that a hard ride north would not be worth. Sunkta set a pace that was as fast as the ground and Avellini's condition permitted and focused his attention on the trail behind them. They had been riding for perhaps 40 minutes, the sky brightening steadily from iron to pale gray above the white expanse of the prairie, when Cinder's ears went back. Not flat, the way they went when she was frightened, but angled sharply rearward, tracking something behind them. Sunkta did not turn immediately. He counted to 10, letting the information settle, then turned in the saddle and looked south along the trail they had just ridden. 2 riders. Coming at a canter. Perhaps a mile back, but closing. They found us faster than I expected, Avellini said, pulling up beside him and following his gaze south. Her voice was steady. Her face was pale from cold and effort, but the steadiness was real. Someone in the settlement told them which direction we went, Sunkta said. He had anticipated this as a possibility and had not let it change the plan because there was no version of the plan in which their departure could be kept secret from everyone in a settlement of 60 people in the pre-dawn dark. Someone had seen them leave. Someone had, in the way that Hester had predicted, answered a direct question from a large and frightening man without much resistance. He looked at the terrain ahead. The trail ran straight and open for the next 2 miles, offering nothing in the way of cover or concealment. The prairie on either side was flat and featureless, the snow broken only by the occasional stand of leafless scrub and the low, dark lines of frozen drainage channels. There was nowhere to hide and no way to outrun horses on a frozen trail with an injured rider. There is a place, Sunkta said, thinking as he spoke, pulling the geography of this stretch of country from the accumulated knowledge of 3 years of trading across it. 2 miles ahead the trail crosses Bitter Creek. The bridge there was damaged in the spring flood and has not been repaired. Riders who know this country go around, a quarter-mile east along the bank to a stone ford. Riders who do not know this country will try the bridge first. How long does that give us? Avellini asked. Long enough, Sunkta said, if we move now. He touched his heels to Dust and they went forward at a canter, Cinder keeping pace beside him, the frozen trail hard and ringing under the mule's hooves. Behind them, the 2 riders had seen the movement and accelerated. The distance between them began to close. They reached Bitter Creek with perhaps 400 yards to spare. The damaged bridge was a sagging, ice-rimed structure of old timber that groaned visibly under its own weight and would not have safely carried a loaded pack mule, let alone a horse at speed. Sunkta turned east along the bank without slowing, following the narrow path through the frozen reed beds to the stone ford, and crossed it with the water black and sluggish around the mule's fetlocks. On the far bank he turned north again and pushed into a shallow stand of scrub cottonwood that lined the creek on the northeast side, pulling both mules to a stop in the deepest part of the cover and sitting absolutely still. 40 seconds later, the 2 riders reached the bridge. He could hear them from 200 yards, the sound of their horses pulling up, the brief exchange of voices. A pause. Then hoofbeats moving east along the south bank, searching for the ford. They knew the country well enough to know it was there, but they did not know exactly where, and the frozen reed beds along the south bank were difficult going at speed. Sumpta looked at Avellini. She was watching the south bank through the scrub with a focused, tight-jawed attention that he recognized as the look of someone managing pain through the simple mechanism of refusing to let it occupy more of their attention than absolutely necessary. Her left hand was pressed flat against her bandaged side. She met his eyes and gave a small, controlled nod that meant she was all right, or close enough to all right that the distinction did not currently matter. They stayed in the cottonwood stand until the riders found the ford and crossed it, following the main trail northeast, having apparently lost sight of Sumpta and Avellini's tracks in the rough, heaved ground north of the creek. Then Sumpta turned dust west, crossed the creek back via the stone ford, and picked up a parallel trail that ran along the north side of a low ridge, invisible from the main trail and adding perhaps 2 miles to the journey but removing them entirely from the line of sight of the men now riding north on the wrong heading. They rode in silence for a long while. The sun came up, small and pale and offering light without warmth, and the prairie around them turned from gray to white to the flat, washed-out gold of a Dakota winter morning. The cold was serious and consistent, the kind that did not announce itself dramatically but accumulated steadily in the fingers and the face and the core, and Sumpta watched Avellini for the signs of it with the peripheral attention of someone tracking multiple things at once. She was stronger than the morning suggested she had any right to be. She rode with the careful, upright posture of someone who had discovered exactly the position that hurt least and was maintaining it with conscious precision, and she did not complain, and she did not ask to stop, and when Sumpta pulled up at a frozen creek crossing to water the mules and rest them for 10 minutes, she dismounted without assistance, walked a short distance to keep her legs from stiffening, and remounted on her own. What he observed during those 10 minutes, and during the long quiet stretches of riding that preceded and followed them, was something he had not anticipated when he had set his boot against Aldred Pruitt's door the previous evening and committed himself to this direction. He had anticipated that the practical aspects of the situation would occupy most of his attention, the route, the pursuers, the documents, the distance remaining. What he had not anticipated was how much of his attention Avellini Hale occupied in the spaces between the practical demands, and how little of that attention was strategic in nature. He had met a great many people in 3 years of traveling the Dakota Territory. Traders, homesteaders, soldiers, lawmen, outlaws, surveyors, missionaries, and the full spectrum of frontier humanity that fell outside any of those categories. He had found most of them comprehensible, many of them decent, a few of them remarkable in specific and limited ways. He had not, in those 3 years, found himself doing what he was doing now, which was paying attention to a person in the way that had nothing to do with assessing risk or planning the next step and everything to do with the simple, inconvenient fact that the person was worth paying attention to. She spoke, after a long silence, without looking at him. "My father used to say that the land remembers everything that happens on it," she said. "That survey work was not just measurement. It was listening. Learning what the land was saying about itself before you wrote it down." She was quiet for a moment. He believed that recording it falsely was a kind of violence. Not just against the people whose claims it displaced, but against the land itself, against its right to be accurately known. Sumpta was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own father, about the lessons delivered beside fires in the Black Hills, about the understanding that the earth was a conversation rather than a possession. He said, "My father would have agreed with him. Though he would have said it differently." "How would he have said it?" Avellini asked. "He would have said that a man who lies about the land is lying about something that existed long before him and will exist long after him, and that the land does not forget being lied about, even when the people do." He paused. He was a man who took the long view of things. Avellini looked at him then, a direct, unhurried look that carried something in it he did not entirely know how to account for. "Two very different worlds," she said, and then she said nothing else, but the observation sat in the cold air between them with the quality of something left deliberately incomplete, an opening rather than a conclusion. They stopped at midday on the south slope of a low rise that broke the wind and gave them a clear view of the trail behind them in both directions. Sunkta built a small, smokeless fire from dry scrub and heated water for coffee from the provisions he carried in his saddlebags, and they ate in the manner of people who were hungry and cold and understood that eating was a practical necessity rather than an occasion for ceremony. Avalini ate more than she had managed at any point since regaining consciousness, which Sunkta noted with the quiet satisfaction of someone crossing an item off a mental list of concerns. She looked at the oilcloth bundle when he set it out to check that the documents had not been damaged by the creek crossing, her father's careful survey notations visible in the top fold. She said, "He spent 20 years on this territory. Every creek bottom, every tableland, every ridge and draw and hollow. He knew this ground the way you know a language you were born speaking." She did not say it with grief exactly, though the grief was there underneath it. She said it with the particular pride of someone who had decided that what was owed to a person's memory was accuracy rather than sentiment. "He deserved better than what happened to him," Sunkta said. "He did," Avalini said simply. "And so did the 40 families along the creek bottoms." She looked up from the documents. "That is why we are 40 miles from Tumbleweed Crossing on a frozen trail in November with at least 2 of Gorham's men somewhere behind us." Sunkta resealed the oilcloth and put it back inside his coat. He looked at the trail behind them, empty and white in both directions as far as the eye could follow it, which on the open Dakota prairie in clear weather was a considerable distance. No pursuit visible. Either they had lost the 2 riders at Bitter Creek or those men had turned back to report and wait for Gorham's direction. Neither scenario was permanently comfortable, but both gave them the afternoon. They remounted and rode on. The light began to change in the mid-afternoon, the sun dropping toward the southwestern horizon and pulling the shadows long across the snow again. The cold deepened with the falling light, becoming less ambient and more specific, the kind of cold that found the gaps in clothing with increasing determination. Avalini had been quiet for the last hour of riding, and when Sunkta looked at her now her face had taken on the concentrated, inward quality of someone managing something that required more active effort than it had required an hour ago. "How far?" she said, without looking at him. 8 miles, he said. "Perhaps 9. He paused, reading the light and the cold and the particular set of her jaw. "We can stop." "We cannot stop," she said, with a flatness that ended the conversation without hostility. He did not argue. He adjusted their pace slightly, finding a rhythm that was fractionally easier on the rough frozen trail without losing meaningful time, and rode close enough that if she needed to say something she would not need to raise her voice against the wind to do it. The last 8 miles took 2 hours. The trail climbed gradually as it approached Morrow Station, the land rising into a low, rolling country of better grass and scattered pine that gave the landscape a different character than the open plains behind them, more enclosed, more various, the kind of country that offered both more cover and more possibility of being surprised. Sunkta rode it with his full attention engaged and his hand near the colt, reading the terrain ahead with the careful, systematic habit of long experience. Morrow Station materialized in the last of the daylight as a cluster of low buildings at the junction of 2 trails, larger than Tumbleweed Crossing and more established, with a proper main street of false-fronted timber buildings and the distinctive squat bulk of a federal marshal's office and jail at the far end. Lamplight glowed in several windows. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys. The smell of wood smoke and horse and frying meat reached them across the cold air while they were still a quarter mile out, and both mules lifted their heads at it with the unmistakable alertness of animals who recognized civilization and were prepared to find it acceptable. The federal marshal's office had a light burning in its single front window. Sunkta helped Avalini down from Cinder at the hitching rail, steadying her when she stepped down, feeling through his hands the tremor of exhaustion and cold and controlled pain that she had been managing for the last 3 hours without complaint. She straightened, adjusted her coat, set her jaw, and walked to the door. She knocked. Footsteps. The door opened on a broad, weathered man of perhaps 50 in shirt sleeves and suspenders with the specific alert stillness of a man who had spent a long career answering knocks at unexpected hours and had learned to be ready for all of them. "Callum Drew," Avalini said. "My name is Avalini Hale. My father was Edmund Hale, Federal Surveyor, Dakota Territory. I have documents relating to the falsification of 40 land claim records and the murder of the man who first reported it, and I need you to hear what I have to say before morning." Marshal Drew looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Sunkta. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in," he said. Marshal Callum Drew was not a man who made quick judgments, but he was a man who made accurate ones. He listened to Avellini for 2 full hours without interrupting, seated behind his desk with his large, calloused hands folded on the surface before him and his eyes moving between her face and the documents she laid out in sequence, each piece in its proper order, each connection explained with the methodical clarity of someone who had rehearsed this presentation in her mind for 14 months and had finally arrived at the room where it needed to be delivered. Sunkta sat to one side and said nothing. This was Avellini's testimony, built from her father's work and her own, and it did not require his contribution. What it required was a witness, and that he provided simply by being present. When she finished, Drew was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the documents spread across his desk, the falsified survey records alongside the originals, Pruitt's deed transfer copies, the sworn homesteader statements, the chain of shell company transactions traced in Avellini's own careful handwriting in the margins of a separate sheet. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that confirms what he already suspected but had not yet been able to prove, with the particular expression of a person whose suspicion has just been given weight and shape and legal standing. "I have had Lexton Gorham's name in my files for 8 months, Drew said finally. "Land disputes from the Creek Bottom settlements. 2 homesteaders who came to me saying they had been served eviction notices on claims they had held for 6 years. I sent inquiries to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office." He paused, his jaw set. The inquiries were returned with documentation confirming the transfers were legal and properly recorded. He looked at Avellini. "Your father's survey notations show exactly where that documentation originated and what was changed to produce it." Avellini said, "Will that be sufficient for a federal warrant?" Drew looked at the documents again. He said, "For a warrant, yes. For a conviction, it will need to survive a courtroom with Gorham's lawyers in it." He tapped the sworn homesteader statements. "These will be contested. The survey discrepancies will require a qualified surveyor to testify. Pruitt will need to testify in person." He looked up at her directly. "This is not finished tonight. But tonight is where it starts." He stood up, called through the door to his deputy, a young man named Foss who had the eager, slightly overwhelmed quality of someone recently appointed to a responsibility larger than anything he had previously held, and began giving instructions in the clipped, organized manner of someone who had done this kind of work many times before. 2 riders to the Territorial Circuit Court office in Yankton, leaving within the hour, carrying certified copies of the documents. A telegraph to the Federal Land Office in Washington. A message to the nearest army post requesting a detachment to assist with the warrants. And Gorham himself, Sunkta said, from the chair by the wall. "He will know by morning that Miss Hale reached Morrow Station. He will know what she carried." Drew looked at him. "What he does about that knowledge depends on how quickly we move," he said. "He has influence in the territorial offices. He does not have it here, and he does not have it in the federal circuit. The leverage shifts the moment those documents are in Yankton." "How long until your riders reach Yankton?" Avellini asked. "Dawn, if they ride through the night," Drew said. He looked at the window, which showed only darkness and the orange reflection of his own lamp. "They will be on the trail within the hour." He arranged rooms for Avellini and Sunkta at the boarding house 2 doors down, the only lodging Morrow Station offered, run by a widow named Greta Pullen who fed them at the kitchen table without ceremony, set lamps in their rooms, and withdrew. Sunkta did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the window of his room and watched the main street of Morrow Station, the marshal's office with its light burning steadily, the 2 riders departing north toward Yankton just before midnight, the dark and silent storefronts on either side of the frozen street. He thought about the trail behind them and the 2 riders he had last seen heading northeast on the wrong heading, and he thought about what Gorham would do when those men reported back to him tonight, and he thought about the specific kind of man Lexton Gorham was. He had built enough of a picture of Gorham over the preceding 2 days to understand the shape of him. He was a man who had operated for 18 months in the space between official legality and practical illegality, who understood that his most effective weapon was not violence but the appearance of legitimacy. He was a man who understood systems and how to corrupt them quietly, which meant he was also a man who would understand, clearly and immediately, that the arrival of Avellini Hale's documents in a federal circuit court represented the end of everything he had built. Men like that did not accept that end quietly. They made one more move. They always made one more move. He was still thinking about this when dust, tied at the rail outside the boarding house, let out a low, carrying bray into the cold night air. Not the sound of an animal wanting water or complaining about the cold. The focused, forward-directed sound of an animal that had detected something specific and was choosing to announce it. Cinder answered from 2 stalls down, a sharper sound, more urgent. Sumpta was at the window in 2 steps. The main street of Morro Station was still and dark, the marshal's office lamp throwing a yellow rectangle onto the frozen ground, the boarding house shadow long and black across the snow. Nothing moved. He waited, counting seconds, reading the stillness the way he had been reading stillness his entire life. Then he saw it. The faintest movement at the south end of the main street, where the trail from Tumbleweed Crossing entered the settlement between 2 dark buildings. A shape that resolved itself, as his eyes adjusted to it, into a man on foot, moving close to the wall of the leftmost building with the careful, edge-hugging motion of someone who did not want to be seen in the lamplight. One man on foot meant others on horseback waiting somewhere outside the settlement's edge, holding back until the man on foot had confirmed where his targets were. It was a pattern Sumpta recognized, the same deliberate, professional efficiency that had been present in the settlement search at Tumbleweed Crossing. He picked up the Colt, checked it in the dark, and went into the hallway. Avellini's room was directly across the narrow passage. He knocked twice, quietly, the specific rhythm he had established with her without discussion, the sound that meant urgency without alarm. Her door opened within seconds. She was fully dressed, her coat already on, her boots laced. She had not slept either. One man at the south end of the street, Sumpta said. More outside the settlement waiting on his signal. He looked at her. We need to move before they have the positioning they are looking for. To the marshal's office, she said immediately. Yes. He went first, moving quickly through the boarding house to the back door that opened onto the alley behind the main street buildings. The alley was dark and narrow, a channel of dense shadow between the backs of the false-fronted structures, and they moved through it at a fast walk, Avellini keeping pace beside him, her breathing controlled and deliberate. They came out at the north end of the alley, crossed the open ground to the back of the marshal's office in 6 quick strides, and came through the rear door into the lamplit interior where Drew was still at his desk and Foss was cleaning his rifle at the side table. Drew was on his feet before Sumpta had finished speaking. He crossed to the front window, eased the curtain aside, and looked south along the main street with the calm, assessing expression of a man taking inventory. He let the curtain fall. Foss, he said. Wake the Hendry brothers and get them in here. Tell them to come through the back. Then get to the livery and put it on the latch from the inside. Foss was out the back door before Drew finished the sentence. Drew checked his own rifle, a heavy lever-action Winchester, with the quick economy of long habit. He looked at Sumpta. How many do you estimate? At least 4, Sumpta said. Possibly more. He has been running operations with 4 to 6 men consistently. Drew nodded, accepting this the way he appeared to accept all information, without surprise or drama, simply as a fact to be incorporated into the shape of the response. He looked at Avellini. He said, the documents your riders are carrying to Yankton, are those sufficient without the originals here? Yes, Avellini said. Pruitt's copies are certified. The riders have everything they need. These originals are additional weight, not the only evidence. Good, Drew said. Then the priority is people, not paper. 20 minutes passed in a silence that had the specific, compressed quality of waiting that precedes violence, the kind of silence where every small sound registers with exaggerated clarity. The stoves ticking. The creak of the building in the wind. The distant stamp of a horse somewhere south of the main street. The Hendry brothers arrived through the back door, two broad, capable men in their 30s who had been pulled from sleep but showed no resentment of it, moving with the immediate readiness of people accustomed to being needed at inconvenient hours. Drew positioned them at the two front windows and himself at the door, and told Sumpta and Avellini to stay back from the windows and away from the lamp line. The man at the south end of the street had not moved. He was still there, a shadow against the darker shadow of the building wall, and he had not given any visible signal, which meant he was still watching, still confirming, still not certain enough of the situation to bring the others in. He became certain 8 minutes later, when one of the boarding house's upstairs lamps moved in an upper window, and the shadow at the south end of the street stiffened and raised one arm in a brief, deliberate gesture directed back down the south trail. 3 riders came in from the south at a canter, spreading across the street the way the settlement search party had spread in Tumbleweed Crossing, covering angles, closing off retreat. One pulled up directly in front of the marshal's office and sat his horse in the lamplight with the specific arrogance of a man who expected the situation to resolve itself in his favor on the basis of the number of men he had brought to it. He was not Gorham. He was a hired man, broad and hard-faced, wearing a heavy canvas duster and carrying a rifle across his saddle with the casual readiness of someone who expected to use it. He called out to the marshal's office in the flat, carrying voice of a man accustomed to delivering ultimatums. "We are looking for a woman and a Lakota man," the rider called out. "We have business with them that doesn't concern the marshal's office. Send them out and we'll be on our way." Drew did not answer from the door. He answered from the side window, his voice carrying the specific authority of a man speaking from behind cover he had chosen deliberately. "This is Federal Marshal Callum Drew. The individuals you are looking for are under federal protection in connection with an active investigation. You are currently obstructing federal law enforcement. Identify yourselves and state who sent you, or disperse and ride back the way you came." A pause. The rider on the horse looked at the 2 men who had come in beside him, a brief exchange of glances that contained the entire calculation of what they were willing to risk against what they had been paid. "One more chance," the rider called out. "Send them out." Drew said nothing further. He looked at the elder Hendry brother, who was at the front window with his rifle, and gave a single, small nod. What happened next was fast and loud and lasted considerably less time than the 20 minutes of silence that preceded it. The Hendry brother put a rifle shot through the upper edge of the doorframe 6 inches above the lead rider's head, a shot precise enough to be a warning and unmistakable enough not to be mistaken for a miss. The lead rider's horse reared, the man fighting it for control. The second rider pulled his own gun and fired at the marshal's office window, the shot going high and shattering the lamp bracket on the far wall. The third rider wheeled and tried to pull back down the street. Then Dust moved. He had been standing at the boarding house rail 50 feet down the street, untied in the confusion of the rapid departure from the boarding house, his lead rope hanging loose. He had been standing there through the entire confrontation with the focused, forward-tilted attention that Sumpta had come to recognize as the mule's particular mode of engaged observation. And when the shooting started and the lead rider's horse reared and the entire scene broke into the chaotic, lurching movement of men and horses in a confined space, Dust did something that defied every reasonable expectation of mule behavior in the presence of gunfire. He charged. Not in panic, not in the blind, destructive flight of a terrified animal, but with the same deliberate, purposeful forward motion with which he had been moving since the morning 2 days ago when he had first turned west along Harrow Draw and refused to be redirected. He came down the center of the frozen street at a full gallop, his pale coat luminous in the starlight, his hooves striking the frozen ground with a sound like rapid gunshots in itself, his large head lowered and his ears pinned flat, and he hit the lead rider's already rearing horse with a glancing impact that was less a collision than an interruption. Enough force and noise and sudden mass to complete the horse's loss of balance and deposit the rider onto the frozen street with a sound that carried clearly through the night air. Cinder, still tied at the livery rail where Foss had locked her in, was making a sound that could only be described as encouragement, a sustained, carrying bray that rose above the noise of the confrontation with the authority of a declaration. The lead rider hit the frozen street and did not get up quickly. The second rider, dealing with a horse that had now decided it wanted no further part of this particular evening, was pulled north 20 yards before he managed to stop it. The third rider, who had been trying to retreat down the south trail, found his path blocked by Drew's deputy Foss, who had come around the south end of the main street on foot with a shotgun and the particular expression of a young man who had decided that this was the moment that defined whether he was actually suited to this work. It was over in 4 minutes. The lead rider was on the ground with Drew's boot on his rifle. The second rider had surrendered his weapon to one of the Hendry brothers. The third had made the calculation that one deputy with a shotgun represented a more manageable situation than 2 Hendry brothers and a federal marshal, and he had miscalculated this badly. Drew had all 3 men in his jail within the quarter hour, charges being written with the methodical care of a man who understood that every word would be read by a federal court. Sumpta walked out the back of the marshal's office and down the alley to where Dust was standing at the south end of the main street, breathing hard, his pale coat steaming in the cold night air, his lead rope trailing in the frozen mud. The mule turned his head and regarded Sumpta with the large, dark, entirely self-possessed expression of an animal who had done what needed doing and was waiting for someone to acknowledge it. Sumpta ran his hand along the mule's neck, checking for injury, feeling for heat or swelling or the catch of pain in the muscle. Nothing. Dust was entirely unharmed. He heard the back door of the marshal's office open and Avellini's footsteps on the frozen ground behind him. She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her against the cold air, and she put her hand on Dust's broad forehead between his ears, and the mule dropped his head into her palm with the trusting, uncomplicated ease of an animal that had decided, apparently some time ago, that this particular person was worth dropping his guard for. "He saved us," Avellini said quietly. "He did what needed doing," Sumpta said. He paused. "He has been doing that since the beginning." He looked at the mule, then at Avellini. "Both of them have." She was quiet for a moment, her hand still resting on Dust's forehead in the cold and the starlight. Then she said, "It is not finished yet. Gorham himself has not been taken. Drew's warrant will reach Yankton in the morning, but Gorham will know before it does that his men failed here tonight. He will move. He will try to disappear into the territory or across the border before the warrant finds him." Sumpta looked north, where Drew's 2 riders were somewhere on the dark prairie between Morrow Station and Yankton, carrying the documents that had started in a burned claim cabin at Pale Creek Bend and a loose stone behind a chimney base and a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. He thought about the chain of custody, the long, careful trail of evidence that Avellini and her father had built across 14 months, and the thing it was now set against. He looked at Drew's 3 prisoners in their jail and the warrant documents being written at the desk inside. Drew has the original documents and 3 of Gorham's men in his jail who will be offered a choice between prosecution and cooperation. A man whose apparent legitimacy disappears finds that the people who knew what he was doing become witnesses rather than accomplices. Avellini looked at him. "How certain are you of that?" she said. He considered it honestly. "Not entirely certain," he said. "But certain enough to have ridden 40 miles on a frozen trail in November." She looked at him for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention that he had come to recognize as the full weight of her, the thing she brought to bear on things that mattered. Then something shifted in her expression, subtle and real and not quite like anything he had seen from her before, not the composed steadiness of managed pain, not the focused intensity of a woman on a mission that had consumed the better part of 2 years. Something quieter than those things and more personal. She said, "I do not know how to thank you for what you have done. Not adequately. I am not sure adequate is possible." He looked at Dust, who was still standing with his head in Avellini's hand with the placid contentment of an animal that had earned its rest and knew it. He said, "My mules dragged me into this. I just did the heavy lifting." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, small and genuine and warm in the cold air. Inside the marshal's office, the lamp burned steadily and Drew's pen moved across the warrant documents in careful, deliberate strokes. Outside, the street of Morro Station was quiet and cold and still, the stars brilliant above the dark buildings, the frozen ground silver in their light. And at the hitching rail, dust and cinder stood side by side in the comfortable proximity of animals that had done exactly what they came to do and were waiting, with the characteristic patience of their kind, to see what the morning would bring. The warrant reached Lexton Gorham before he expected it to. That was the part he had not calculated for, and it was the part that undid him. He had operated for 18 months on the assumption that the machinery of federal law moved slowly, that the distance between evidence and action in the Dakota Territory was measured in months rather than days, and that a man with the right relationships in the right territorial offices could introduce enough friction into that machinery to buy himself whatever time he needed. He had been correct about this assumption for 18 months. He was catastrophically wrong about it on the morning of November 1, 1878, when a federal warrant issued from the Circuit Court in Yankton arrived at the Gorham Land Acquisition Office in the town of Caldwell Flat, 40 miles southwest of Tumbleweed Crossing, carried by 2 federal deputy marshals who had ridden through the night and who had brought with them a detachment of 6 Army cavalry troopers specifically to ensure that the arithmetic of the situation was not open to negotiation. Sunkta and Avellini learned this 2 days later, still in Morro Station, from a telegram that Marshal Drew received and read aloud to them in his office with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose instinct that the lever was in the right place had proven correct when he threw it. Gorham taken into custody without resistance, Drew read. 3 territorial office officials also detained pending investigation. Federal Land Commissioner's Office in Yankton has assumed jurisdiction over all pending claim transfers in the affected area. Drew set the telegram on his desk and looked at Avellini. It has started moving, he said. It will not stop now. Avellini sat in a chair across from his desk and was still for a moment in the way that people are still when something they have been bracing against for a very long time has finally been set down and they are relearning how their body feels without that weight. Then she looked at the window, at the cold November sky above the Morro Station rooflines, and Sunkta, watching from the chair by the wall, saw something in her face that was not triumph and was not relief and was not grief, though it contained elements of all 3. It was the expression of a person who had kept a promise to someone who was no longer alive to receive it. The complicated, particular stillness of that. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, to no one specifically, he would have been glad to know it. Nobody in the room felt the need to add anything to that. The formal proceedings that followed moved at the pace of federal law, which was neither fast nor slow but had a grinding, inexorable quality that Gorham's lawyers, expensive and capable as they were, could not ultimately redirect. The Circuit Court in Yankton convened a special session in February. Aldred Pruitt testified for 3 days, his voice thin and careful and precise, reading from the copies he had kept in the ledger behind the loose panel in his desk drawer, explaining each transfer and the specific irregularities he had identified at the time of processing. He was not a heroic figure at the witness table. He was a frightened man who had waited too long and was finally, at considerable personal cost, doing the thing he should have done 18 months earlier. The court received his testimony with the sober attention it deserved. The 3 displaced homesteaders whose sworn statements Avellini had collected testified in person, each describing in plain, direct language what they had built on their claims and what had happened when the eviction notices arrived. Their words had a quality that the legal documents could not fully carry, the specific weight of people describing the loss of something they had made with their hands over years, something that could not be replaced by a court judgment no matter how favorable. Avellini testified last. She was on the witness stand for 4 days. She presented her father's original survey notations alongside the falsified territorial records, walking the court through the discrepancies with the patient, systematic clarity of someone who had studied this material until she understood it better than anyone alive and was now transferring that understanding to 12 men in a jury box who had no particular reason to trust land records they had never seen before. She was composed and precise and, when one of Gorham's lawyers attempted to characterize her father's original findings as the product of clerical error rather than deliberate falsification, she produced 3 independent corroborating surveys from different years that made the same measurements and recorded them identically, which foreclosed that avenue of argument so completely that the lawyer did not return to it. Lexton Gorham was convicted on 7 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 1 count of obstruction of federal land survey proceedings. He was sentenced to 22 years in the federal penitentiary at Sioux Falls. The 3 territorial office officials who had facilitated the record alterations received sentences ranging from 4 to 9 years. The shell companies through which the stolen claims had been held were dissolved by court order, and the 40 land claims along the creek bottoms south and east of Tumbleweed Crossing were returned to their original holders or, in cases where the original holders had been driven off and replaced by others acting in good faith, adjudicated according to the specific circumstances of each case. It was not a perfect resolution. Perfect resolutions did not exist on the frontier, where the damage done to 40 families over 18 months could not be fully repaired by any court proceeding, however thorough. Some of the displaced families had moved on, scattered to other territories and other lives, and could not be located. Some of the claims had been so altered by the intervening time that returning them required negotiations that stretched well beyond the court's original mandate. The machinery of justice, even when it worked imperfectly, and Avellini understood this without being diminished by it. She had not gone to Morrow Station expecting perfection. She had gone expecting accountability, and accountability was what the court had provided. Edmund Hale's death was officially reclassified from accidental to homicide. The specific individual who had arranged it, a man named Cord Vell who had served as Gorham's primary field operative, was identified through the testimony of one of the 3 men Drew had arrested on the night of the confrontation in Morrow Station, convicted of second-degree murder, and sentenced to 15 years. The territorial record was amended. Edmund Hale's name appeared in the official proceedings as the original discoverer of the fraud, the man whose careful and principled work had set in motion the chain of events that ultimately produced the conviction. It was a small thing, in the way that official acknowledgments are always a small thing measured against the actual fact of a person. But it was accurate, and accuracy, Avellini had learned from her father, was not a small thing. Sumpto was present for the verdict. He had ridden to Yankton for the final day of proceedings at Avellini's request, arriving the evening before the jury returned with Dust and Cinder both looking somewhat incredulous at the scale and noise of the city after the quiet of the winter prairie. He sat in the gallery of the circuit courtroom and watched Avellini receive the verdict with the same composure she brought to everything, her face still and her hands quiet in her lap, and he watched her afterward, on the steps of the courthouse in the cold February air, finally let some of what she had been carrying show in her face, not with collapse or drama but with the slow, visible relaxation of a person who has been holding themselves at a particular tension for a very long time and has just received permission to release it. He stood beside her on the steps and said nothing. She did not need words. She needed someone to stand beside her while the tension left her, and that he could do. After a while she said, without looking at him, "What will you do now?" He thought about it. The question had a larger scope than its surface suggested, and both of them knew it. He had arrived at this situation as a man who had constructed his life around the deliberate avoidance of anything that put down roots deep enough to cost him something when they were pulled. The preceding months had not been that kind of life. The preceding months had been exactly the opposite of that kind of life, and he had discovered, somewhere along 40 miles of frozen Dakota trail, that the opposite was not what he had been afraid it would be. "I expect I will continue trading between the settlements for a while," he said. He paused. "The northeast route through Morrow Station has become more familiar to me recently." Avellini was quiet. The February wind moved through the courthouse square, cold and thin, carrying the smell of wood smoke and river water. Then she said, "I have been in correspondence with the Federal Land Office. They are looking for experienced surveyors to assist with the redocumentation of the affected claims. The work will take at least 2 years. Someone familiar with the creek bottoms and the high ground between the drainages would be useful." She paused. "Someone who knows how to read country." He looked at her. She was looking at the courthouse square, her profile composed and still, and there was a very faint color in her face that had nothing to do with the cold. "Your father's work," he said. She said, "My work now." She paused. "I have my father's field notes and his instruments and 20 years of his teaching. I know what he knew. I intend to do what he did, and do it correctly, and make sure the record says what the ground actually says. She turned and looked at him then, directly and without pretense. I would like to not do it alone. The courthouse square was busy around them, people moving in and out of the building, the noise of Yankton's main street audible from the next block over, horses and wagon wheels and the general productive clamor of a territorial capital going about its business. In the middle of all of it, Sunkta stood on the courthouse steps and looked at the woman beside him and thought about what his father had told him once, that a man who stopped listening eventually got himself killed. He thought about two mules in a dry creek bed on a gray October morning, patient and certain, pulling toward what needed to be found. He said, I know this country better than almost anyone alive. He looked at her with the quiet, direct attention he had been giving things his whole life. I would be glad to not do it alone either. The spring came to the Dakota Territory the way it always came, not gently but with the particular violence of a season asserting itself against the one that preceded it, the snow going fast in late March, the creek bottoms flooding briefly and then receding to reveal the dark, rich mud of ground that had been resting under ice for 5 months and was ready to be worked again. The prairie turned green in patches first, then broadly, then completely, the buffalo grass coming back with the determined persistence of something that had survived a great deal and knew how to keep surviving. Sunkta and Avellini began the survey work in April, starting with the 12-mile stretch of creek bottom south and east of Tumbleweed Crossing where Edmund Hale had first identified the falsified boundaries. They worked methodically and carefully, recording what the ground actually said, correcting the record where it had been made to lie, establishing the true boundaries of each of the 40 claims with the patient precision of people who understood that accuracy in this work was not merely professional but moral. Avellini worked with her father's theodolite and his field notebooks, cross-referencing his original measurements against the ground as she found it, and Sunkta ranged ahead and around, reading terrain, identifying landmarks, understanding the country the way it had taught him to understand it over 34 years of living in it and listening to it. They were a good team in the practical sense and, as the weeks accumulated, in other senses as well. Their respective knowledge fit together in ways that were useful and also, on occasion, surprising to both of them. She knew the legal and technical language of land documentation. He knew the land itself, the way water moved through it in spring, the way the frost heaved certain clay banks and not others, the way the old Buffalo Trail markers aligned with survey lines that had been laid before either of them was born. Together they produced a body of survey work that the Federal Land Office in Yankton later described, in the formal language of official correspondence, as exceptional in its thoroughness and accuracy. This was the kind of description that did not convey the full reality of what it represented, which was two people working in the open air of the Dakota Prairie through the spring and summer of 1879, learning each other alongside the country they were documenting, building something in both registers simultaneously. Dust and cinder were present for all of it. They carried the survey equipment and the field notebooks and the provisions and the camping gear, and they did it with their characteristic combination of occasional theatrical complaint and utterly dependable performance. Dust developed a habit of positioning himself near whatever landmark Avellini was currently measuring, as though offering himself as a supplementary reference point. Cinder developed an equally reliable habit of alerting to any presence on the trail before Sunkta or Avellini detected it, her ears going up and forward in the specific manner that Sunkta had learned, over 3 years, to treat as authoritative. On a September evening in 1879, with the survey work substantially complete and the prairie going gold and amber around them in the first cool breath of autumn, Sunkta and Avellini sat beside a fire at the edge of a creek bottom that had been correctly documented and legally restored to the family that had farmed it for 6 years and been driven off it for 18 months and had returned to it in the spring with a determination that the land itself seemed to recognize and reward. The fire was small and the night was clear, the stars enormous above the open country, the creek audible in the darkness beyond the firelight. Avellini was writing in her survey journal, recording the final measurements of the day in her father's precise, careful notation style, which she had adopted so thoroughly that the handwriting in her notebooks was nearly indistinguishable from his. Sunkta was sitting across the fire watching her write, in the way that he watched things that mattered, with the full and unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the world revealed itself most honestly to those who were willing to simply look at it without demanding that it hurry. Dust was standing at the edge of the firelight, dozing on his feet with the comfortable indifference of an animal that had long since decided the world could be relied upon to sort itself out. Cinder was lying down, which she almost never did in the presence of people, her dark eyes half closed, her breathing slow and deep. It was, Sunkta thought, as close to a declaration of trust as Cinder was ever likely to produce. Avellini closed the journal and looked across the fire at him. She said, "My father would have liked you." He thought about that. He said, "I think I would have liked him." She smiled, and it was the full version of the almost laugh he had first heard on the steps of the Morro Station boarding house in November, warm and real and carrying in it all the complicated, layered history that had brought them to this fire on this prairie on this evening. She reached across and took his hand, and he turned his palm up to receive it, and the fire settled between them with the soft sound of wood becoming coals. The creek ran in the darkness beyond the fire. The prairie stretched in every direction under the September stars, vast and quiet and accurately documented, saying what it actually said, the way it always had, to anyone willing to listen. And two mules stood at the edge of the light, as they had stood at the edge of many things over the preceding year, patient and certain and entirely unbothered by the distance the world had traveled to arrive at this particular moment of stillness. There is a particular kind of ending that the frontier produced, not the clean, declarative kind found in novels written by people who had never stood on the Dakota plains in November, but the kind that arrived quietly, without fanfare, as the accumulated result of small decisions made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. The kind of ending that looked, from the outside, like a beginning. What Sunkta Wolfstride had been, before two mules dragged him west along a dry creek bed on a gray October morning, was a man who had decided that the safest posture toward the world was a kind of strategic distance, present but not involved, useful but not essential, moving but not arriving anywhere in particular. What he was after, on an evening in September 1879 beside a small fire on a correctly documented piece of Dakota prairie with his hand in Avellini Hale's hand and Dust dozing at the edge of the light, was something considerably less safe and considerably more real. He had arrived somewhere. He intended to stay. The survey work was completed and filed with the Federal Land Office in early October 1879. The 40 families along the creek bottoms received their corrected title documents before the first snow of the season. Aldred Pruitt was granted a reduced sentence in recognition of his testimony and returned to Tumbleweed Crossing, where he resumed his work at the land office with the particular carefulness of a man who had learned an expensive lesson about the cost of silence and had no intention of paying it twice. Marshal Callum Drew was commended by the Federal Circuit Court for his handling of the Gorham investigation and went on to serve another 11 years in the Dakota Territory, developing a reputation for the kind of steady, unglamorous effectiveness that the frontier needed most and recognized least. Hester Crane received a formal letter of commendation from the Circuit Court, which she apparently used to line the bottom of her wood box. It was, by her own account, the most practical use she had found for official correspondence in 12 years of frontier living.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.